Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of the 401 Access Denied podcast. I'm the host of the show, Joe Carson, Chief Security Scientist in Advisory CISO at Delinea. And it's a pleasure to be here with you. I'm always excited about these opportunities to spend an hour of my week talking to industry experts and really amazing people in the industry that really allows us to learn, to educate about different topics. So the podcast itself is brought to you by Delinea, an organization that really provides identity security at every interaction along the way, specifically helping organizations manage and protect and secure identities. So as always, it's fantastic to have another amazing guest to the show. So I'm brought to you Wenzel. Wenzel, welcome to the podcast and episode. If you would give the audience a bit of a background about who you are, what you do, and some interesting things about yourself.
Thanks, Joe. Appreciate having me on the show, and it's super exciting to be here and great to be able to hopefully discuss some pretty exciting and interesting topics, and hopefully to able to provide some information. I think background for myself, I'm currently the Chief Executive Officer and co-founder for a cybersecurity company called Deepen, based in New Zealand, and I guess that's where I call home as well. And from a background perspective, I don't know where to start. That's a difficult one. I think the question I often get asked is, how did you start in cybersecurity, or how did you get into it? Because everybody's got their different sort of cybersecurity story and the moment that they made that switch, because I think it's very rare to have started in that space. And I guess when I was starting working, there was no such thing as cybersecurity experts. It didn't even exist in the field.
It was part of your job typically. It was an addition to what you were doing in the day-to-day activities.
Correct. Absolutely. That was the expectation. And some of the first things I used to do was when organizations started getting connected to the internet, I was helping them take old 486 and Pentium computers with super formatted floppies running Linux router
bringing
project.
Back the memories.
That's right. Yes. And using two network cards and then creating basic sort of firewall rules and security. And I guess that sort of developed into a bit of a passion, doing the same with Linux for a while. And while I dabbled in that area for a while, it wasn't until a few years later I was working in an organization in New Zealand, in a large telecommunications provider, and really had this question asked and posed to us by a customer. We were delivering all of these network services to them, and they posed this question and said, "Are your services secure?" And while this was many, many years ago now, we all sat there and thought to ourselves, yeah, we think it's pretty secure. And the customer came back and said, "Can you provide us some details of how you think it's secure and why you think it's secure?" And really that started a massive journey of learning for me, which was this eye-opening experience of where security used to be part of what you do. So you naturally make sure that your server's hardened, you naturally make sure that you recompile your kernel, you remove unnecessary services, and you do all of the right things. But then really when the question gets asked of you, are you secure? How do you answer that question, and how do you get across that? How do you measure it? Correct. And I don't think I can probably answer that question fully yet, because it's such a massive field and such a massive area. But I think that for me was that jump into security, and from a pretty sort of network centric and server Unix and Windows background, I sort of focused into that security space, and have really stayed in it ever since. Worked in a number of different roles across network security, telecommunications, but it was always about how do you provide security services out to customers, and how do you continue to answer that question of, am I secure, or have I done enough, and am I doing the right things to protect myself?
So I think it's always an important question is, to ask yourself, am I secure? And, that's always a good, kind of point where you can actually go back and take a look and see, because in this industry, it changes so quickly. The threats are evolving, the technology is evolving, transitioning to cloud, connectivity is always changing, new devices. And I think it's, and you've got shadow IT, you've got, employees who's using lots of different services. So that question, am I secure, is always something that I think it's really important to think about, is that, I may have been more secure yesterday than I am today. What things can I do differently to keep the momentum and keep making sure that, that reevaluation is always kind of moving in the right direction?
Yeah, that's the challenge. I guess that's how do you know what you're doing is the right thing? and how do you focus in the right areas? And I remember many years ago, I met with a chief executive, and he said to me, he asked me this question. He said, Wenzel, all I really want to do is I really need to be able to pass the blush test. And I said, what do you mean with a blush test? And he says, I want to be able to stand that if we have a security incident, I want to be able to stand in front of the board, and I want to be able to say that we've confidently and reasonably, we've done everything that we reasonably could to be able to protect ourselves. Doesn't mean we were able to avoid the incident, but we did all, and we took all the reasonable steps. And I guess, and that was what he called the blush test, so that he could stand in front of the board without blushing, but knowing that he hadn't done the necessary to protect his organization.
Absolutely. I think I always go back to, before I moved into, I worked in IT, in general IT, before I moved into cybersecurity kind of as a dedicated focus. So at the time, security was just, as you said before, something you did in your day-to-day job. And I always remember one of the kind of areas that I was working for was managing and responsible for ambulance service and also emergency calls. And I always remember that because it's the point where you're saying is that, yes, there's everything you can do to be preventive, and to, make sure that things do not happen. And in a great society, no one ever has an accident. No one ever needs to call an ambulance. But I always learned that ambulance was the importance of the response, is how you respond, how quickly you respond, and what you do in that can make a massive difference. And my SLA back then was 23 minutes. If I didn't get an ambulance to the emergency scene or the accident within 23 minutes, the likeliness of that person who was in the accident of dying increased significantly after 23 minutes. So getting that response, and that always got me into, you can do preventive, how you respond as well. It's always about making that balance. It's about making sure you can actually respond in the right way. And I think a lot of organizations are realizing that you do everything you can to. I think your point is, if the executive's getting up in front of the board and they're saying, we did everything to, how we did to preventive, but things do happen. Configurations might get missed, or shadow IT occurs, and something incident happens, and it's really important that, and this is how we responded. And the response sometimes always makes a massive difference. Some organizations do really well at responding to incidents, and some not so well. I think it's always finding that balance across the board.
Absolutely. The response piece is key. And I think the question and being able to respond to an incident really poses that interesting question when you walk backwards from that and you say, so what incidents do I need to be able to respond to? Which incidents should I allow for? Which incidents should I consider?
Mm-hmm.
And then how do I best prepare for those so that when they occur, I can respond as quickly as I can and meet that 23-minute SLA, which is a pretty tight SLA. So yeah.
It was a tight SLA, and it was the whole thing, and it made it complex as well, because when I had that SLA, one of the things was that, back then, for areas that we did not have, road coverage, because one of the things is strategically putting your ambulances in all the different locations around the country to make sure that you could beat that SLA, and it wasn't always possible. And one of the agreements we had, because I was based originally in Northern Ireland, was we had the agreement with the military that we would use their helicopters in certain emergencies, that they would assist in areas that we did not have coverage. But then we had the peace agreement and the army moved out. So I had an urgent challenge back in the late 90s, was that, how do I maintain that SLA? What coverage did I need? And that was one of the areas about then having to replace the emergency kind of locations to continue to meet that SLA. And that was always challenging to make sure that, because there was also legal requirements. Going back to, in cybersecurity, we've got frameworks, we got regulation, we got governance, we got compliance, we got SLAs that we had to meet. And then that was actually a requirement that if that 23-minute SLA was not met, there could be legal consequences. And that was something that I was, held accountable for. My boss would have been pulled up in front of lawyers and politicians if something had happened that we were not able to achieve. I always remember, actually, there's one time that the most ever time I was ever stressed out that I was really struggled with, it was Y2K. Y2K was actually, for everyone else, we all put the floppy disks in, we changed the date, everything went on as normal. But I had a challenge beforehand, was that we were changing the power supply, because we were directly connected to the mains. So if there was a power outage, that there was a fear of Y2K would happen, that we moved to a backup generator, so we would continue to operate even if the power was out. And during that transition, we made some mistakes. And when we powered down the servers and powered everything back up, one of the console screens, the terminal, didn't come back on. And that was the most stressful thing because the clock was ticking and we saw that we were actually getting so close to that 23 minutes. It actually really stressed me out. Lucky enough, it was basically just the back end. The monitor had a faulty cable. So everything was back up and running. We just could not see it. So that was probably, for me, was the most stressful time I've ever been in, was when you're getting close to those SLAs, being not met.
I can imagine that's when the adrenaline starts really pumping, doesn't it?
It does indeed. It was one of those situations where it was three people. It was me and two of my colleagues that were sitting in the server room, and we're all looking at each other. And it's one of those situations where, you're sitting around, you've got lots of smart people around you, and you're looking at each other, and everyone had run out of ideas. And even to that date, I still actually have a serial cable in my kit as a backup, just in case. I doubt it will ever happen again, and I'll ever need that serial cable. But I actually carry it with me. I always have it, just because it has become a memory now to always make sure that whatever I do, is I always have backups of backups and alternatives of everything. And I think that's the approach that when you're going earlier, you're saying about am I secure? The question always gets into is, do I have alternatives? Do I have backups of backups and all those things that when things do happen that you've thought about? And in your background in telecommunications, it's always there's two of everything. There's two networks, there's two routers, there's two paths, because resiliency is part of it's the part of what we need to be looking at, is how do we make systems and services as resilient to as many different types of attacks as we possibly can.
It's an often overlooked part of our jobs, is the fact that as a cybersecurity practitioners, our job is to make sure we cover the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information systems. And
absolutely,
I've had that quite often when I've started sticking my nose into organizations and asking questions around how is your network configured, where do you run your fiber optic cables, what's your switching environment look like, let alone how do you do backups and recovery? But shouldn't you be worried about stopping hackers breaking into your environment? Yeah, no, I'm equally interested in the availability of your infrastructure and your systems, because it doesn't necessarily take a hacker to take your entire environment down. It could be as simple as a faulty cable, or somebody flicking the wrong switch. So it's absolutely something we need to be aware of. And availability in some organizations that I've worked with, in particular critical services like you were in the ambulance service, availability is more important than anything else.
Absolutely. I mean, for me, if I always remember back, is that if I put the CIA triad into its whole kind of prioritization, availability was always that top one. Is the service must be always available. And I had that window that, throughout the year, 23 minutes consecutive, that availability was on top. Second one was integrity. If I didn't have, for example, when emergency calls come in, and if I didn't have the data and to where to send those ambulances, that if we didn't have the addresses and the maps and locations and the equipment that was in those ambulances, even for the victims having their medical record history to make sure that the paramedic isn't giving them a drug that they're actually allergic to. So getting integrity of the data then became next, is that we had to make sure we had the best data possible in order to make critical decisions quickly. And then, yes, the rest was, about making sure then, securing and resiliency and alternatives. So yeah, sometimes you have to prioritize what is the most important part of that system or service that's being provided. And then focusing the efforts around making sure that you have a service that is always available, as resilient as possible, and the integrity of the data is as accurate as you possibly could get. And then, yes, you had to then put security around it. And it was a very complex, very challenging thing to do, because sometimes security can impact availability and can impact, when you're putting enforcement in place. And I want to get around to, there's a topic that, we discussed, beforehand, when we think about these systems and the concept of zero trust as well. When did you first learn about, zero trust as a strategy and framework? What's your kind of experience and background with the concept of zero trust?
It's an interesting one. And I guess probably I would generate some controversy by asking the question is, how new a concept is zero trust to begin with? the basic concept is, and people, firstly, I think zero trust means a whole bunch of things to different people. And I guess from my perspective, sort of zero trust means the fact that you change your paradigm from a traditional sort of wall and moat model, where you assume you can protect your perimeter, where you move much more to a model where you look at security across your endpoints, your applications, your infrastructure, your data, and your network. And you get those 6 areas working together harmoniously and managing your policies and your security profiles across those to ensure that threats, as they move laterally across your organization, identified and protected against, always with this assumption that any one of those layers or any one of those areas can get compromised, and you need to assume that the information that you're seeing is produced or part of malicious activity. So if you look at that as zero trust, really, and to me, I love the term, I love the concept, and I love the idea that we're driving towards this model or this framework, getting those 6 areas working together harmoniously. As a concept and the idea, is it really a more modernized and automated way of looking at defense in depth?
Absolutely. I do think one of the first times I remember the concept is when it was mostly focusing around the network side. It originated from, network management. And it was more when organizations we used to have one network and we defended that, the moat, and the castle walls and stuff so you had those boundaries and you made sure that nothing bad get into it, no bad apples fell in it, basically damaged everything else. And then there was that phase where we had to do network segmentation. And then you had very trusted networks, where your servers and all your kind of assets and very important data lived. Then you had your corporate devices, which was, okay, those devices move in and move out of the network. They go onto the wild internet, they come back in, and you don't know what infections they get during that time. So it was kind of almost like a semi-trusted fully network, but not as much as you trusted your server side, because that's where you had full control over. And then we get into the bring your own device side, or the DMZ, or, the area that was like, okay, there's things in there that may be good or may not be good. So that network, itself is less trusted than the other ones. So I get really into that scenario, but that's how do you maintain and that different, let's say, control that you had over the networks really determines, the segmentation, how well you allowed traffic to flow in between those. And I think this is really where, that concept, and it lived around for a long time in network segmentation, having, those areas of VLANs where you could put a device that, was, let's say, infected with some type of, malware or malicious application. You could put it into that VLAN, clean it up, which was an untrusted area, and then bring it back in once it's been scanned, cleaned up, and made healthy again. And that was that kind of common process. But I think as, we went through the last 10 years, what's happened is that more and more of organizations' infrastructure has moved out of their own network control. So now we're living, basically, our network traffic and our networks is the internet. So the internet by nature is a very untrusted network. And that meant that, yes, now you had to assume that, let's say, nothing was trusted. So that's where that whole zero trust concept applies to everything. So I think it is a very important framework and mindset that how you look at, managing infrastructure and devices and data and networks and access. I always struggle personally when I'm talking with security-minded people. Zero trust is something that they can relate to very, very well. When I move and I start talking to the business side of things, if I'm talking to a CFO and saying, yes, we're going to implement the zero trust strategy, the CFO gets scared, or the HR gets scared, because they're like, you mean you no longer trust us? Is it going to make our job harder? Are we going to do things slower? So I think the term resonates really well in the security industry, because it's almost a let's say, branding somewhat of, as you mentioned, defense in depth. That's what defense in depth, it is a defense in depth strategy around basically that kind of where those devices and kind of the data flows. But when you communicate with a business, I think we struggle as a security industry to rephrase it into something that is actually meaningful from a business concept. And that's always something that when I'm talking to the business, I have to use different terminologies rather than calling it zero trust. I call it, zero assumptions, or, it's a continuous verification process. So you always have to somewhat rebrand it a little bit when talking with a business. Have you found similar challenges when you're talking, different people, as you mentioned. A lot of people have different interpretations of it as well.
Absolutely. I think that's a massive challenge, is that there is no consistent interpretation. And as soon as you try and talk to a board about zero trust architecture, you've already lost most of the people there, because they go, well, what does that mean? How does that apply to me? What is the reality of it, and how do I apply it? And I think so the way that I tend to look at it is I start with it from a threat-based context. I say that the way we need to look at it is that threats move laterally across organizations, so they don't travel in silos. So traditionally, we would have looked at our security controls, like you say, network segmentation. We would have looked at protecting the network environment and segmenting things off within that area. And we would have looked at protecting endpoints with antivirus deployed on those 95 laptops, or something along those lines. And all of those systems kind of would have worked in their own fashion, in a semi-isolated way. And while we try and aggregate alerting and bring that together into a centralized into a scene platform or a monitoring system, really what we're looking at is we're looking at those systems in an isolated way. With a zero trust sort of concept, or a zero trust architecture, what we're saying is that we accept the fact that threats will move naturally across our environment, and they'll go across those 6 areas of zero trust. And our job is to be able to know that any one of those areas is probably not enough to be able to identify and protect against that threat. And we need to be able to get our endpoints and our identity systems and our applications and all of those other areas, networks, to talk together and to work together to be able to manage those threats as they move sort of horizontally across our organization.
Absolutely. And today, one of the big things, I think the concept of zero trust is important, that it's adaptive. It's an adaptive security control. It's not something that's static. It's like, depending on the threats, you got to re-verify. If somebody comes in and their identity's been compromised from an access control perspective, then you've got other measures of controls that will actually make sure that only authorized people can access. It could be things like multi-factor authentication. It could be behavioral analytics for that person. Is it coming from a known device that you've seen before? Are they using the browser that they commonly use? Maybe in the past they were using a Firefox, and today it comes in as, Chrome or Edge. That might be suspicious because this person, that's not part of their behavior, common controls or common areas or identification that they would have done in the past. Maybe it's happening at 3 o'clock in the morning, where their normal work days are 9 to 5, Monday to Friday. So using all of those, that intelligence and insights, and applying it to zero trust models allows you to really determine about, when do I need to double check something? Has the risk changed? And I think it's also important as well, one of my concepts as well, and this was when I realized years ago, when I realized that my job was transitioned to being more risk-based focused rather than cybersecurity. Cybersecurity is a skill. My job is about evaluating and managing risk of systems and services. And it got me thinking of, that anytime when you're putting zero trust in place, I think one of the top priorities that we need, and it's always missed, I think it's about the concept of zero friction, is that we don't want security to cause people pain. And when we go down the path of zero trust, sometimes it can be something that can trigger friction. So therefore, I always say that it's important that, if you're taking that approach, you should also prioritize zero friction, which means that, am I making this employee's life better? And actually, am I allowing them to do their job more efficiently, more effectively, with zero trust in that mix as well? So I think it's really important that, we want to make sure security is usable, and we want to make sure that people don't accidentally, because sometimes when we put too harsh security controls in place, too many locks on a door, what happens? People don't lock the door. They just leave it open so that it makes their lives easier. You'll get employees, circumventing and trying to find ways around it. What's your thoughts around making sure that when we do apply zero trust, about making sure that from a usability perspective, that's also part of the strategy?
I think that's a really, really good and a really important point. And I've always been a firm believer. Well, actually, I say always. I was at one point part of the no department when it came from to. I have to admit that was at one point the answer to every question was no. But let's talk about it. Certainly in the more recent years, my approach has always been, and part of our organization as well, has been around that security should enable organizations to move faster. And the analogy that I often bring up, and I'm still trying to find a better analogy, is thinking about it like brakes on a car. So the brakes on if you imagine a car without brakes, if you're trying to work out where to stop, or you're trying to go fast. You can't go fast because you never know when you're going to need to stop and how long it's going to take you to stop. So brakes on a car are there to enable the car to move faster and be safer. And that's the
Absolutely.
way that I consider security, and it should be. And zero trust as a concept, if it's applied effectively, I think it actually enables that, and enables that frictionless outcome to organizations. Because if you're continually reassessing, like you say, if you're revalidating the posture and you're revalidating the behavior of the individual or the system and the actions that are happening, you can apply security as is appropriate based on the risk profile of the activity that's being undertaken. And that's, I guess, what I really like about it, is that when you see a zero trust environment effectively deployed, you're enabling users to be able to carry out their functions. And if they're doing things that are within predicted norms and predicted behaviors, and you've got all that telemetry across the different like your identity telemetry is going together with the application that they're trying to access from the network that they're connecting to, and the endpoint that they're using, all of that information gets correlated together into that centralized policy engine, and actions are allowed or disallowed, and then additional challenges only applied when needed. And we can move away from this system where multi-factor authentication should be applied every 3 hours. And I mean, I still remember some of that.
And rotating passwords every 20 days, and
Correct.
It just creates pain, and it does impact productivity, and it does have a cost to the business.
It does. And I think that's where if we effectively deploy zero trust into an organization, it actually allows us to provide that frictionless environment much more easily than using traditional mechanisms. And I've got a funny story there. I still remember the one organization I was working with, multi-factor authentication was applied, and literally by default, it was back in the old days when it was first enabled, and it was enabled overnight, and it was set to by default call the person's mobile phone for authentication. And literally I met with the senior leadership team, and I said, "Oh, well, how's your security journey going, and how are things going?" And they said, "It's absolutely terrible." I said, "How do you mean?" And they said, "This multi-factor authentication thing is just the worst." And I said, "Can you give me some more details?" Well, the problem that I've got is that every time I try and go into my laptop and check something, my phone starts to ring, and I could be sitting in a meeting and trying to just quickly check something on my laptop, and my phone starts ringing, and I have to sort of try and listen on my phone for codes and put it in and everything else. And I go, so that's obviously where we missed a trick. And the security team, as security practitioners, if we're deploying these in systems frictionless way, we can do much better to make sure that they provide a positive user outcome. And if that's the interaction that the business has with the security team, then when we call them up and ask them for help to deploy the next set of features, or we need their support when an incident happens, we're really going to struggle to get buy-in and support. Yeah, ensuring a frictionless outcome is absolutely key.
Because ultimately, then it makes people want to use security if it actually makes their lives better. You just reminded me of another one I've seen, an organization who rolled out multi-factor authentication as well. But what they ended up doing was they enabled all possibilities. So multi-factor authentication became almost like the last one, because people were then able to use, pins and security questions. And that was so they had many options. And it meant that they thought they had multi-factor authentication enabled. So they had one choice, but the rest basically weakened it and resulted in that, all of a sudden, that the benefit of having MFA and what they'd rolled out had actually less security applied, because it was just one of multiple options, because they want to make sure that the employees could easily access things. And they assumed that, this was a multi-factor authentication policy, but ended up having, simple security questions as a backup, alternative, and actually made security worse at the same time, all because they want to make sure that they were not impacting people's productivity. So sometimes it can be not unconfigured, in the wrong way. That can actually, cause security to be weaker. So what recommendations would you have for organizations that we could down this path? What were some of the resources or some of the steps or starting points? If somebody was to go on, let's say, start the journey to zero trust, what would you say would be some of the first things they should be doing?
That's an interesting one, Joe. And I think I look at it and go, I've got a very technical background, so I come from a technology space, and I've moved much more into sort of a governance and compliance side of things, and looking at organizations holistically. And I've stood there many, many times and preached the fact that any business outcome requires a combination of people, process, and technology, and that technology on its own can't solve business problems. When it comes to zero trust, there's this interesting part of it, which is that can we create a zero trust outcome, and can we allow automated policy enforcement and telemetry sharing unless we adopt an ecosystem? I guess my view is that, and when you say ecosystem, you immediately go to pick a technology ecosystem. Can you create a zero trust environment by having a whole bunch of discrete technology stacks and creating and setting up integration between them and maintaining that? Yes, you can. If you're in New Zealand, like where I am, and most organizations don't have a lot of resources available to them, it really starts with a conversation of, can I adopt an ecosystem that is going to provide me zero outcomes across multiple areas without me needing to deploy discrete technologies and get them to communicate with each other. So interestingly enough, while I don't consider myself while I don't necessarily believe that it should be a technology first conversation, in the case of investing wisely and creating outcomes that are manageable from an ongoing perspective, I think organizations do need to take a step back and say, regardless of what our procurement rules are, regardless of how we approach things, we need to have a holistic view, and we need to adopt an ecosystem approach, and we need to buy into a longer term journey of deploying that ecosystem aligned to those 6 zero trust areas.
Absolutely. I think it's really important as you're going through and you're selecting technology partners and solutions, and just having that question is that, what capabilities, does this enable from a zero trust perspective? And making sure then, you start thinking about interoperability as well. So I think it's important, absolutely. I think a lot of, when I hear organizations go down the path of, even passwordless and zero trust and multi-factor authentication, the challenge they get into is that their ecosystem, they might have some legacy. And that legacy is sometimes what's preventing them from moving forward into those areas. And I think it's important, to assess the risk of those, and to reevaluate, how can they make sure that their ecosystem, supports their strategy, so they can actually make sure that they can move towards that strategy, or at least the areas that they can move, at least they've identified it as well.
I think we have to accept the fact that no organization has got the bottomless pit of money these days to be able to replace all of their legacy systems. And therefore, anything we do is, and I guess the way that I approach it with organizations is I say, you need to consider this as a journey. So zero trust isn't a destination you arrive at overnight. It's a journey you go on for the next 3 to 5 years. And the important part is to define what the journey is and how you're going to get there, and what your strategy is to get there over time, and which partnerships are the right partnerships for you to get there over that time. And I guess that's where governance becomes really important, because governance is what helps you to ensure that as an organization, you stay aligned to that path, that journey that I often refer to it as the North Star, that you set your North Star and you align to it and you stick with it for the next 3 to 5 years, because even a small organization, it's going to take a period of years to be able to move towards any sort of meaningful sort of zero trust environment.
Absolutely. I think I always remember one of my favorite, terms of referring to zero trust was it's a mindset and how you wish to operate your environment in a secure way. And so it's always that, it's continuous. And to your point is, you might have technology, but you also have the people operating it, and you also have the processes that support that as well. And it's a continuous journey. It's almost like, you go on the journey, but you never ever reach the destination. You never ever get there. It's striving to keep moving on the momentum and towards that, but you just have to keep practicing it. That's ultimate. It's almost like a cultural change in regards to how you operate the business.
Absolutely. Culture is key. And I think that culture, thinking, mindset aligns really well with that governance side of things, and using that to sort of drive the direction and to maintain your course.
Absolutely. Is there any resources that you would, point to people as good things that they want to learn more? And if anyone from the audience does have any follow-up questions or would like to contact you, what's the best way to reach out and connect with you?
Absolutely. The best way to contact me is definitely over LinkedIn. So just reach out and connect, and always happy to have conversations and answer questions as best as I can. In terms of resources, that's a challenging question because there are so many out there, and I think one of the biggest problems that we have is just trying to keep up with the sheer amount of new information that comes out there. I get all of the usual sort of updates and advisories sent out to me. And I guess if I had to pick something different to other people is that don't underestimate the value of reading books. There are some really, really good security books that have been written over the years that are sitting on shelves. And while I don't have a list with me, I'm happy to share a list at some point. But one that comes to mind based on the conversation that we had just now was there's a really good book by Adam Shostak called Threat Modeling.
Yes.
And I guess it's one of those books that's a must read if you're going to get serious about security and you want to get involved in that space. And I highly recommend it. And it's definitely one of those things that always sits on my shelf. And I find myself reaching out to it continually, or not continually, I should say. There always seems to become an occasion where I find it useful to reach out to. But the other things that are really, really good these days, I think, is all of those threat intelligence reports that organizations are putting out. And I think we need to verify the information we read. We need to be really careful these days to make sure that we're using multiple sources to validate and verify what we're reading. And I think we also need to be, as security practitioners, we need to be really mindful that as new threats emerge, we can't immediately work with organizations and redirect all focus to a new threat. We need to be able to consider in context of what is the organization's threat landscape and be able to have a sensible approach to it, but still be able to take in all of those new threat intelligence reports. And, the Verizon data breach investigation report is fantastic for that.
Absolutely.
And use all those methods, but use them in the context of the landscape and the organizations that you're dealing with an understanding of what their business priorities are and what assets they're trying to protect.
Absolutely, that's crucial. Even the Verizon data breach investigations, that's one of my go-to. It's almost like my security scorecard. But you're absolutely right. We have to apply it, the context to the business. Is what is the business doing, and what's vital to that business, and then how does the security or the intelligence apply to that? Because for every organization, it might be slightly different, and therefore sometimes you have to take a slightly different approach. And absolutely, Adam's book is awesome. It's fantastic. For the audience, if you do a little bit of tip is, sometimes I would recommend going and taking a look at the Humble Bundle. And Humble Bundle is a site where basically sometimes the publishers will put a series of books out related to a topic. And on occasion, you'll get either Wiley or you get Pecht, or you get No Starch Press as well. And sometimes those books will come out available. So keep an eye on the Humble Bundle. It is the ebook formats. What I tend to do is if I find the ebook is very, very interesting and helpful, I end up going and buying the physical book or sometimes even the audio book. So I end up having multiple copies, but definitely an area to keep an eye on, the Humble Bundle. Wenzel, it's been fantastic.
Tip.
Yeah, it's a really good tip because you can get a lot of books for a very low cost, and also gives you a bit of a insight so you can take a look at it before you might buy the physical book as well. So it's been awesome having you on. I really, really enjoyed the conversation. This is always a highlight of my week, is getting to talk to really interesting, really intelligent and fun people that I learn lots from. For me, this is almost like my training and knowledge kind of burst of the week. So Wenzel, it's been awesome having you on. I really hopefully you will be able to cross paths again and catch up again in the near future. For everyone in the audience, thank you for always coming and listening to the episodes. I hope these are always valuable for you. Tune in every 2 weeks for the latest 401 Access Denied podcast by Delinea. Please go and subscribe through your favorite channel, favorite medium, whether it being on Spotify or Apple Podcasts and other means that you'll be listening to podcasts on. Subscribe. Make sure you can go back, take a look at some of the previous episodes as well. It's always something that I'm always looking to make sure that we share insights, knowledge, and that at the end of the day that you come away with more knowledge and more ideas to really go and apply them to your organization, and sometimes even your own life, your personal life. These practices can also help make the world a safer place. So take care, stay safe, tune in every 2 weeks, And until next time, thank you. All the best.
Very much.